The afternoon of Saturday, June 23rd, began with a simple plan. The Wild Boars football team had just finished a grueling practice session under the intense Thailand sun. They were energized, laughing, and looking for adventure. The assistant coach, Ekapol Chantawong, known affectionately as Coach Ek, agreed to take the boys into the local Tham Luang cave system. It was a rite of passage for local youth, a cool, dark playground to explore, leave their names on the cave walls, and celebrate a teammate's birthday. They parked their bicycles at the main entrance, propping them against the rusted iron railings near the cave's gaping mouth. They slipped on their backpacks, turned on their cheap, battery-powered plastic flashlights, and stepped across the threshold, leaving the warm air of the tropical afternoon behind. They had no idea that the monsoon season, which usually arrived in mid-July, was about to strike weeks ahead of schedule. As the boys ventured deeper, crossing the massive entrance chambers and navigating the sandy floors of the first kilometer, the sky outside broke open. A sudden, violent meteorological shift unleashed a massive tropical deluge upon the mountain. Millions of tons of water began to pelt the limestone peaks of Doi Nang Nan. The mountain, riddled with sinkholes and hidden shafts, acted like a giant funnel. Water did not just run down the slopes, it sank directly into the rock, filling up hidden reservoirs and rushing downward through unseen vertical fractures. Deep inside the cave, the wild boars were entirely oblivious to the weather shift. They were nearly 4 kilometers into the mountain, navigating a known landmark called the T-junction, when they noticed the ground beneath their feet changing. The dry sand was turning into mud. Then, a low, vibration-like hum began to echo through the stone walls. It was the sound of a subterranean river waking up. Suddenly, the water came. It wasn't a slow, creeping tide. It was a rushing wall of turbulent, muddy water, thick with silt, rocks, and debris. The main exit path back to the entrance was instantly cut off as low-hanging ceilings, known to cave explorers as sumps, filled completely to the brim. Coach Ek immediately recognized the mortal danger they were in. In a cave system during a flood, your only chance of survival is elevation. You must find high ground and pray the water doesn't reach the ceiling. Turning his back to the exit, he gathered the frightened boys and pushed them deeper into the darkness, climbing higher up the sloping mud banks of the cave's inner chambers. They kept moving until they reached a small, elevated, muddy ledge surrounded by rising water, roughly 4 kilometers from the surface. The trap had sprung. The entrance was sealed by hundreds of thousands of tons of pressurized, fast-flowing water. The boys were now buried alive under a kilometer of solid mountain rock. Back on the surface, night fell, and the nightmare began for the parents. 13 bicycles remained chained to the entrance fence, soaked by the relentless rain. By midnight, local park rangers and emergency services were alerted, but as they stood at the mouth of Tham Luang, they realized they were facing an unprecedented catastrophe. The water level inside the cave was rising at a rate of up to 15 centimeters per hour. It was muddy, cold, and moving with immense kinetic force. Local authorities quickly realized that standard search and rescue teams were completely out of their depth. This wasn't a standard cave rescue. This was turning into a deep surface saturation event. The Thai government mobilized the Royal Thai Navy SEALs, an elite military unit trained for extreme combat and maritime operations. But as the SEALs arrived on the scene, they encountered an invisible enemy they had never been trained to fight: zero-visibility cave diving. Unlike open water diving, where a panicked diver can simply ascend to the surface, cave diving takes place under a solid ceiling of rock. If something goes wrong, there is no escape. The water inside Tham Luang was so thick with suspended sediment that it was described by divers as trying to swim through cold, turbulent iced coffee. High-powered dive lights were completely useless. The light beams simply bounced off the thick silt, blinding the divers. To move forward, the Navy SEALs had to crawl along the jagged floor and walls of the cave, feeling their way blindly through the rushing current, fighting against a torrent that threatened to rip the regulators straight out of their mouths. They lacked the specialized equipment, the training, and the psychological conditioning required for this specific breed of extreme diving. Within 48 hours, the rescue attempt stalled. The current was too strong, the water was too dirty, and the cave was completely choked. Realizing the scale of the crisis, the Thai government issued an international call for help. This call reached the Global Cave Rescue Network, a small, highly specialized subculture of civilian hobbyists who spend their free time exploring the most dangerous underwater passages on Earth. Among the first to respond were British cave divers John Valanthan and Rick Stanton. These were not young, buff military men. They were middle-aged civilians. Valanthan was an IT consultant, and Stanton was a retired firefighter. But they possessed a very specific, rare set of skills that the military completely lacked. When they arrived at the chaotic camp outside Tham Luang, the atmosphere was bleak. Massive industrial pumps were trying to drain the cave, but the relentless monsoon rains kept filling it back up. The Navy SEALs looked at the British civilians with skepticism. Stanton and Valanthan did not waste time. They geared up, using custom-built, highly modified equipment designed to fit through impossibly narrow gaps. They stepped into the flooded cave and began laying a thin guideline, a lifeline known as a horovoi konets, deeper into the pitch-black labyrinth. Progress was agonizingly slow. The current was so fierce that it could easily sweep a diver away or crush them against the jagged limestone ceiling. Every meter forward required immense physical exertion and absolute psychological control. If a diver panics in a cave, they die. Panic causes hyperventilation, which depletes oxygen and impairs judgment. In zero visibility, if you lose your grip on the guideline, you are essentially dead, doomed to drown in a dark pocket of water just inches away from safety. Days bled into one another. By day 9, the world had almost given up hope. The general consensus among experts was that the boys had either drowned when the cave first flooded, or had succumbed to starvation, hypothermia, or a lack of oxygen. The atmosphere inside an unventilated cave chamber rapidly degrades as carbon dioxide levels rise and oxygen drops. Yet, Stanton and Valanthan kept pushing forward, navigating past submerged chambers that had become chaotic washing machines of debris. They reached a critical milestone known as Chamber 3, which the Navy SEALs had managed to establish as a forward base, and from there, they swam into the unknown, crossing a deep, fully submerged section towards an area called Pattaya Beach, where they hoped the boys might have taken refuge. When they finally surfaced at Pattaya Beach, they found nothing but water and mud. The ledge was submerged. Heartbroken, they assumed the worst. But Stanton noticed that the cave continued further. They submerged again, swimming through another tight, flooded choke point. On July 2nd, 9 days after the wild boars vanished, Rick Stanton and John Valanthan surfaced in a small, air-filled chamber about 400 meters past Pattaya Beach. The air smelled foul, thick with the stench of damp earth and human waste. Valanthan shone his light beam across the dark, muddy slope at the edge of the water. Out of the darkness, 13 skeletal figures emerged, blinking against the unaccustomed glare of the flashlight. They were alive. The boys had survived by drinking clean condensation water dripping from the cave walls and using meditation techniques taught by Coach Eck to stay calm and conserve their energy in total darkness. The British divers were ecstatic, but as they looked at the weak, emaciated children and then back at the swirling, mud-thick water they had just crawled through, a cold reality set in. Finding them was the easy part. Getting 13 terrified non-swimming children out through kilometers of flooded, pitch-black tunnels was a logistical impossibility. They had found them alive, but they had no way to bring them back. The discovery of the wild boars, alive on that muddy ledge, triggered a global wave of euphoria. But inside the command center at Chamber 3, the atmosphere was dead silent. The initial joy vanished the moment the rescue team looked at the hard data. The boys were 4 kilometers deep into a collapsing, flooded mountain. To get out, they would have to navigate a series of completely submerged, zero-visibility passages, some of which were so narrow that a grown man could only squeeze through by removing his oxygen tanks and pushing them ahead of him. The children did not know how to swim, let alone dive. If a single child panicked for even 10 seconds under the water, they would thrash violently, rip off their mask, drown themselves, and likely kill the rescue diver trapped in the narrow tunnel with them. The immediate challenge was keeping them alive where they were. The air on the ledge was rapidly running out. The 13 survivors were consuming oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide into a confined, sealed chamber. If the oxygen level dropped below 15%, they would suffer hypoxia, lose consciousness, and die. The Thai military immediately dispatched a team of Navy SEALs, including a military doctor, Pak Loharnshun, to swim to the ledge with high-calorie gel packs, blankets, and medical supplies. They made the treacherous journey and reached the boys, committing to stay with them on the ledge. But the environment was brutal. The temperature inside the cave hovered around 20 degrees Celsius, and clad only in wet football jerseys, the boys were fighting the early stages of hypothermia. Outside the cave, a massive geopolitical and engineering war was being waged against nature. Over 10,000 people had descended upon the site. More than 100 government agencies, structural engineers, military specialists, and volunteers from across the globe were trying to find an alternative exit. Teams scrambled up the dense jungle slopes of the mountain, searching for hidden shafts or sinkholes that might lead directly down to the boys' chamber. If they could find a vertical chimney, they could drop food down or dig them out. Massive drilling rigs were hauled up the treacherous mountain tracks, chewing into the solid limestone. But the geology of the mountain defeated them. The rock was too thick, the maps were inaccurate, and drilling risked causing a catastrophic structural collapse inside the cave, crushing the children beneath millions of tons of rubble. Simultaneously, engineers mounted the largest pumping operation in Thai history. Over 1 billion liters of water were pumped out of the cave system, enough to fill 400 Olympic-sized swimming pools. The surrounding countryside was deliberately flooded, destroying local rice crops, as farmers willingly sacrificed their livelihoods to save the children. The pumps worked 24 hours a day, screaming under the strain. For a brief moment, the water levels dropped slightly, raising hopes that the boys might be able to simply wade out. But the monsoon was relentless. Dark, heavy clouds hung over the Doi Nang Nan mountain range, and meteorologists delivered a devastating forecast. A massive, multi-day tropical storm was heading directly toward the region. This weather report changed everything. The engineers confessed that if the heavy rains hit, the pumps would be completely overwhelmed. The cave would flood to the ceiling, drowning the boys, the Thai Navy SEALs, and the doctor on the ledge. The rescue team was trapped in a vice. They could not wait for the monsoon season to end in 4 months, because the air on the ledge would suffocate them within days. They could not drill down to them, and they could not pump the water out fast enough. The clock was ticking down to 0. They had to act, and they had to use the underwater route. It was during this desperate window that the true horror of the situation was realized. A retired Thai Navy SEAL, 38-year-old Saman Kunan, volunteered to help transport oxygen tanks along the escape route. The route was divided into sections, and divers had to place spare tanks along the guidelines so that the rescue divers wouldn't run out of breathing gas. On the night of July 5th, Saman Kunan completed his mission of delivering 3 tanks to Chamber 3 and was swimming back to the entrance. Somewhere in the dark, cold waters of a submerged sump, his oxygen ran out. Whether it was an equipment malfunction, extreme fatigue, or a miscalculation of his gas consumption, Kunan lost consciousness in the zero-visibility water. His dive partner tried to revive him and dragged him back to the surface, but it was too late. The death of an elite, highly trained military diver sent a shockwave of terror through the entire rescue camp. The message was loud and clear. If a professional Navy SEAL could not survive this cave passage while simply swimming in a straight line, how could 13 malnourished children survive it? John Valanthan and Rick Stanton knew that the conventional methods were dead. They realized that there was only one logical conclusion, a plan so radical, so ethically terrifying, that it had never been attempted in human history. To save the children, they would have to completely eliminate the human element of fear. They would have to take away their consciousness. The plan was to put the children into a deep, medically induced coma, turn them into inanimate objects, and swim their unconscious bodies through the flooded tunnels like pieces of luggage. To execute this, they needed a very specific asset. They contacted Dr. Richard Harris, an Australian anesthetist and an extraordinarily experienced cave diver. When Harris received the call, he initially refused. As a medical professional, the plan sounded like madness. Administering general anesthesia in a sterile hospital operating room requires a team of nurses, heart monitors, and complex ventilation equipment. Doing it on a muddy ledge in absolute darkness, and then submerging an unconscious person underwater for hours meant almost certain death. If a child's tongue fell back and blocked their airway, they would suffocate. If the anesthesia wore off mid-tunnel, the child would wake up in a blind panic, inhale water, and drown immediately. If the dose was too high, their respiratory system would shut down. Dr. Harris traveled to Thailand, walked into the cave, and assessed the situation. He realized there was no alternative. It was either try this insane medical gamble or leave 13 people to die in the dark. He agreed to do it, but he made the Thai authorities sign an official diplomatic immunity agreement. He was convinced he was about to sign the death warrants of 13 children, and he did not want to face criminal prosecution when he brought out a succession of corpses. The strategy was finalized. The most dangerous, narrow sections of the cave would be managed by the world's elite civilian cave divers. Each diver would be assigned one unconscious child. They would strap the child to their chest or hold them beneath their body, face down in the water, so that any fluid or saliva would drain out of their mouth rather than down into their lungs. They would use specialized positive pressure full face masks that sealed completely around the child's face, ensuring that even if they breathed unconsciously, no water could enter. On July 7th, the clouds above the mountain turned black, and the first raindrops of the massive storm began to fall. The rescue commander looked at the sky, looked at the rising water meters, and gave the order. The operation would begin the next morning. It was an all-or-nothing gamble. 13 lives hung in the balance, and the divers knew that the first mistake would be the last. On the morning of July 8, 2018, the rain was falling heavily over the Doi Nang Non mountain range, and the clock had finally run out. Inside the cave, deep on the muddy slope of the chamber, Dr. Richard Harris prepared his medical kit. The atmosphere was surreal. The 12 boys and their coach were calm, having been prepared for what was about to happen. One by one, Harris approached the children. He administered a precise, heavy cocktail of 3 drugs: alprazolam to crush their anxiety, atropine to dry up their saliva so they wouldn't choke on their own bodily fluids, and a powerful dose of ketamine. Ketamine was the wild card. It is a dissociative anesthetic that does not merely put a patient to sleep. It completely detaches the brain from the body, paralyzing the conscious mind while leaving the respiratory system functioning automatically. Within minutes, the first boy went completely limp. His eyes rolled back into his head, his muscles went slack, and he fell into a deep, unresponsive coma. The divers immediately went to work. They fitted the child with a specialized positive pressure full-face mask, checking and rechecking the seals. If a single drop of water leaked into that mask, the boy's natural gag reflex would fail in his unconscious state, his lungs would fill with water, and he would drown silently. The divers strapped the boy's hands behind his back to prevent his limbs from snagging on the jagged rocks, and then they submerged him face down into the cold, turbulent, zero-visibility water. Each diver was entirely alone with their human cargo in the darkness. Rick Stanton, John Valanthan, and a handful of other elite international divers took turns navigating the treacherous 4-kilometer gauntlet. The physical and psychological horror of the journey was unimaginable. A diver would be swimming through a pitch-black tunnel, fighting a violent, dragging current, while holding a completely lifeless child beneath his chest. Because the visibility was absolute zero, the divers had to navigate entirely by feeling the guideline with one hand, while using the other hand to feel the child's face, constantly checking for the rhythmic hiss of the exhaust valve to ensure the boy was still breathing. The danger was structural and mechanical. In the narrowest choke points of the cave, the space was so tight that the divers had to unclip their own air tanks, push them through the gap ahead of them, and then drag the unconscious child through the jagged limestone crevice. Every scrape against the rock threatened to rip the air mask off the child's face. If the mask shifted even slightly, there was no way to fix it in the pitch black without risking immediate drowning. The most terrifying variable was time. Ketamine is a short-acting anesthetic. Its effects wear off after about 45 to 60 minutes. The entire extraction process through the flooded sumps was calculated to take upwards of 3 to 4 hours. This meant that midway through the dark, underwater labyrinth, the children would begin to wake up. Dr. Harris had anticipated this nightmare scenario. He trained the primary divers on how to administer secondary injections of ketamine underwater. At designated air pockets along the route, the divers had to haul the limp bodies of the boys out of the water, check their vital signs, and plunge a syringe of ketamine directly through their clothes into their thighs, praying they calculated the dosage correctly in the dark before submerging them back into the abyss. Outside, in Chamber 3, a massive human chain of hundreds of rescue workers, including Thai Navy SEALs, U.S. Air Force personnel, and volunteers, stood ready. When a primary diver finally emerged from the final flooded sump into Chamber 3, they handed the unconscious boy over to the land teams. The boys were strapped into specialized rescue sledges and hauled over steep, muddy rocks, passed from hand to hand through the semi-dry chambers of the cave towards the entrance. The operation was staggered over 3 agonizing days. On the first day, 4 boys were successfully extracted. The world watched in disbelief as the ambulances screamed away from the cave mouth, rushing the comatose children to a secure hospital isolation ward. On the second day, another 4 boys were brought out alive. The system was working, but the physical toll on the divers was immense, and the water levels inside the cave were beginning to rise again as the storm outside intensified. On July 10th, the final day of the operation, the remaining 4 boys and Coach Eck were scheduled for extraction. The tension inside the cave was suffocating. Dr. Harris was the last diver left in the inner chamber, having personally anesthetized every single survivor. As the final boy was swam out, Harris geared up and began his own journey back to the surface. Just as the final child was being cleared through Chamber 3, disaster struck. one of the massive main industrial water pumps, which had been fighting the rising floods for weeks, suddenly suffered a catastrophic mechanical failure. It blew out with a loud bang, and the water levels inside Chamber 3 began to rise violently within minutes. Dozens of rescue workers, who were still inside the cave securing the equipment, had to flee for their lives, scrambling through the rising torrent in a frantic rush to reach the surface. Against all statistical probability, against the laws of wilderness medicine, and against the very mountain itself, the gamble paid off. All 13 survivors were successfully extracted from the depths of Tham Luang. Not a single child died under the water. The wild boars had been pulled from the jaws of the earth. The Tham Luang rescue remains the most daring, complex, and dangerous cave rescue operation in human history. It proved that when human ingenuity, specialized skill, and sheer desperation collide, the impossible can be achieved. But as the lights finally dimmed at the entrance of Tham Luang, and the cave was left to be completely swallowed by the monsoon floods, it left behind a stark, chilling reminder to the world. The mountain had spared them this time, but beneath the surface of the earth, in the deep, silent places where the water runs cold and the stone closes in, there is an absolute, unforgiving darkness, and there is no light below